My name is Jean Mutlu. I'm an assistant professor at Acadia University in Nova Scotia, Canada. I work on border security in relation to the European Union's external borders, as well as the current migration crisis that is happening in relation to Syrian migrants living in Turkey. Previously, I was working at a university in Turkey, during which I have started a 3-year project looking at the legal status and the integration process of Syrian nationals living in Turkey. So I'm currently finishing a book on Syrian nationals living in Turkey and looking at how Turkish policies, in line with sort of the European Union's policies, have created a precarious situation for the Syrians, in that because of the geographical exception that Turkey applies to the Geneva Convention, Syrians cannot apply for refugee status in Turkey, but rather they can be temporary protectee status people. So they're guests that have de facto refugee status, but in principle, their status is not protected by the international convention that governs the refugees around the world. So I'm looking at what are the long-term implications of that and what kinds of situation do Syrians find themselves. So I look at 4 separate areas: the broader theme of integration, healthcare, education, and labor force participation, and argue that Turkey is failing Syrian refugees in all of those 4 categories, even though Turkey provides an essential service to all of these refugees, because that there is no immediate end in sight for the Syrian conflict. And even though if there would be an end, most of the refugees would still have to be outside of Syria because of the sort of social and political dynamics in Syria. People that have escape because they were opposing the regime. And if the regime ends up being victorious, then they can't go back. So Turkey needs to provide some long-term services like language education, long-term healthcare, long-term labor force participation. But because of the declining economy and declining political situation in Turkey, you have long-term problems slowly emerging. So in the short term, Turkey is seen as an exemplary case of how a developing country can provide aid for refugees. But in the long term, we're seeing some of the trends that we saw in Europe or elsewhere of xenophobia and other kinds of anti-migrant sentiments emerging in Turkey already. So it's been about 5 years, 6 years, depending on when you start counting, since the beginning of the influx of refugees into Turkey, and we're seeing already a spike in anti-migrant violence in towns that have higher percentage of Syrians living. But also important to understand that at this point, about 4% of Turkish population is Syrian. And that happened in the last 5 years. So within 5 years, from 0 or very low amounts of Syrians to about 3 million Syrians living in Turkey. And that's a very high number, even for countries that have a history of migration. Given that Turkey has no history of migration, it's actually really interesting to see how Turkey is dealing with it, and how Turkey is dealing with it outside of the UN convention and the UNHCR's mandate. Because all of the services are provided by Turkish authorities under Turkish law and not under UN supervision. So it's actually a unique case that is worth studying and understanding. And there's a lot of misconceptions in what's happening in Turkey because scholarship is limited, because of other reasons that are going on in Turkey, that not much scholarship, international scholarship, is coming out of Turkey at this point. So I see that the research that I have done and the research that I'm still conducting to be sort of an interesting bridge. I think that there's a discussion in Turkey about what's happening in Canada, especially sort of after the election of the Liberal government, with Justin Trudeau's promise to bring about 30,000 refugees within a very short span of time. Turkey was one of the 3 countries that provided the pool of Syrian refugees that then ended up in Canada. The issue that I think that increasingly the Turkish authorities are having, especially the Turkish president is having, with the sponsorship model that Canada has, is that they are perhaps rightfully arguing that Western countries are picking the most economically viable, economically desirable candidates from Turkey and Lebanon and Jordan, and then making the case that they're very good at integration. But the Turkish claim is that, of course, these people are more able to integrate into your societies because they already have the language skills, they already have the social capital and the sort of the economic know-how to stand on their feet. Now, we're seeing in Canada that that's not necessarily always the case, but I think from a populist perspective, that's an appealing argument that then sort of speaks to the certain anxieties that the Turkish population has. Like I said, there's a level of xenophobia that already exists in Turkey, and that is being further fueled by these stereotypical racialized images of Syrians begging on the streets or relying on social welfare, and then the president then coming out and saying the West is picking all the qualified Syrians and leaving us with the Syrians that need the most help. So look how generous we are, but look how sort of, misleading the West is. And that's a particular problem that I think Western authorities are not acknowledging, and that creates a further resentment. Because if you look at the statistics, even today, if a Syrian goes to the UNHCR office for relocation in Turkey, the appointment, not the status, takes about 8 to 10 years. So they get an appointment, they get a wait list for 8 to 10 years to even get an appointment. So that means that they have to live in Turkey for 8 or 10 years, or they sort of find irregular routes to sort of cross into Europe and apply for asylum. And then the secondary conversation that we're having is good refugees wait in camps, bad refugees jump the queue and try irregular routes. But that's a false binary, that we don't have good refugees that stay in camps. Stay in camps is no longer really a feasible alternative if you have kids and if you want to have a future. So you, of course, sort of save money and try these irregular routes. I don't know who said that, but no one puts their kids in a boat if they think the sea is safer than the land. And it's just that we have created a system where the sea has become a more hopeful future than staying back and waiting for that lottery, the magical lottery, to come. And as we know, that lottery doesn't come for a lot of people. There are people in camps in Kenya and Tanzania that have been camps for generations because sort of sponsorship doesn't work fast enough.